Hey guys, if you're watching this, which you should be, school hasn't gone back. So this is, I guess, how things are going to be for the next, who knows how long. I'm recording this obviously in the PE office and I'm all by myself because you guys are on holidays. We're starting energy systems. Well, that's what we would have been starting had we been at school, but hey, we're still going to start it now anyway. Now, hopefully you've done the holiday homework. If you haven't, get on with it. Let's have a look at this. So the energy systems, there's three of them, okay? And the food that we consume is where we get that energy from, okay? And there's a whole heap of stuff that happens in the meantime, and it all gets changed, if you will, into the fuel. So the very, very basic fuel that we need is ATP. Okay, so all muscular contractions that happen within the body are a result of this ATP being present within the muscles. Okay, if we don't have it, then we don't have the energy for muscular contraction, which means that we don't end up moving. We would just effectively, we'd be dead. So there's three systems. There's the ATP-PC system, or adenosine triphosphate, and then the fuel that replenishes that system, the fuel that powers that system, is phosphocreatine, which is where the PC comes in. Okay, there is the anaerobic glycolysis system. Some texts that you may read, not your textbook, but some of the other, if you look through other textbooks or look through old notes or whatever it might be, may refer to this system as the lactic acid system. That's not right. I mean, it is right, but VCAR, I believe for this study design, maybe even before then, they changed it. So you have to refer to it as the anaerobic glycolysis system in SACs and exams and all that sort of stuff. All right, so make sure that you use that terminology. You've got to use the correct terminology, otherwise, come exam time, if there is exams, you won't be getting the full marks. And then finally is the aerobic energy system, which is it's the predominant energy system for a lot of activities. Sitting and resting, like I'm doing at the moment. The demand for energy is not great, so the aerobic energy system is able to supply the energy for what I'm doing at the moment. If I was to jump up and start exercising, then that would be a different story, but we'll look at that a little bit later on. So ATP gets recharged during activity, and it also gets recharged after activity, and this is what we'll get into this topic as well. And this is, I mean, I've said it a number of times to you that you will need to understand this energy system interplay topic quite well to, I guess, do well for the remainder of the year. Okay, it's not like a light switch, and that's what people seem to think. That it first is the ATP system, and then second it uses the anaerobic glycolysis system, and then third it uses the aerobic system. That's not exactly how it works. Okay, so we'll get into that in a little bit. So where does the fuel for the systems come from? All right, I already said at the start that the food that we eat, okay, it comes from all the carbohydrates. And what are the other ones? I'm sure you can tell me, those doing health, those of you that have done biology, all that sort of thing, but I can't ask you questions, so I guess I just have to tell you. It comes from the carbohydrates, it comes from the fats, and it comes from the proteins. Okay, and there is a different percentage of each of those But that's basically where we get them from. So the little squiggly line there, the ATP, PC, and the anaerobic glycolysis system, they get their names because it means without oxygen. Okay, the aerobic energy system that uses oxygen to break down the the chemicals. So we get our food. Food goes in, okay, and then it provides us with the energy for muscular contractions, for activities, for all that sort of stuff. Okay, if we don't eat, we don't get energy, which is why we feel, tired, lethargic, and eventually you'll, starve to death. The foods need to be broken down. They get broken down into their most basic chemical forms. Okay, so it gets stored, like I said, we have carbohydrates, we have fats, we have proteins, and they get broken down. So they're the three macronutrients. You've probably heard that term macronutrients mentioned in health before. So carbohydrates, the sugars, the starches, all that sort of stuff that's found in fruits, cereals, pasta, breads, vegetables. I'm sure you can give me more if I asked you. Things like rice, for example. They're all rich in carbohydrates. It's got Troy walking around in the background. Then you have your fats, which it gets stored within the fatty tissues and the muscles in the body. So usually you have, they'll be in oils and butters and margarines and cheese and yogurts and stuff like that. Okay. And then finally, you've got your proteins. Protein doesn't get used for energy. It is used, like it says here, for growth and repair, but in extreme cases, like really extreme cases, we're talking like if you were to look up videos on Hawaiian Ironman, that you would see protein being used as an energy source. Okay, those people that almost collapsing on the finish line, that is protein in action. So generally it's used for growth and repair, and it's found in like all your red meats, your fish, your poultry, eggs, so on and so forth. And I don't know whether you can hear me anymore. So back again, Troy's finished doing his work. So how does it all happen? Once we've eaten the food and everything, it's got to be broken down. So it goes into our stomachs and it gets broken down by the chemicals and so on and so forth. All the good stuff gets taken out, which is all the basic sugars or the glucose, okay? And then it gets stored in the liver. So remember that the glucose is stored in the liver, and glycogen is where the sugars get stored in the muscles. So that's where those basic sugars go. The fats, they get broken down into free fatty acids, okay, and triglycerides, and they're stored in the adipose tissue. So adipose is just another way of saying fatty tissues. Finally, the proteins, they get broken down into amino acids, and they get stored in the muscles as well. Right, so that's where those all get stored. How much do they contribute to energy? Well, that varies. Okay, so after the digestion and absorption, they get carried into the bloodstream and all the cells of the body. So some straight away, they're used to power the energy systems. And then the other ones that aren't used, they get stored, like we said, in the muscles, in the liver, in the fatty tissues, and they're used dependent on the activity that's being done. So if it's a relatively low intensity activity, then it might be stores like fats. If it's a higher intensity activity, things like carbohydrates, because the fats, as you'll see in a bit, they take a lot longer to break down. They require more oxygen as well. So this is the contributions. So the majority of the energy that we get from carbohydrates, that's the predominant food fuel that the body likes to use. Okay, so about 55-60% of our intake comes from carbohydrates. So like I said, those get stored, the carbohydrates, they get stored in the muscles and the liver. So 55-60% of the dietary intake. Fats, they equate to about 25-30%. They get stored as free fatty acids, they get stored in the tissues, fatty tissues, so on and so forth. And then the proteins are about 10-15%, and they get stored in the muscles around the body. Okay, so make sure that you commit those numbers and those storage locations and how they get stored. Make sure you commit those to memory, because there is a high chance that you'll be asked questions like that in the exam. All right, so I'm going to try out my pen. Let's see. Yeah, these. Whew, I broke it. I've broken it. My pen didn't work. I can't go back either. Never mind. Okay, so what I want you to do now is the chapter questions, chapter check questions 1 to 3. And it doesn't say what page it's on, so hold on a sec. I'll have to find the page. The questions that I want you to do would be on page 110, so questions 1 to 3. I should really change that. Oops, my bad. And there are the questions anyway. Yes, okay. And no cheating either. Oh, well, looks like I can't skip forward. Never mind. So let's go through the answers then once you've had some time to do it. If you haven't, pause it now and go and do it. So, provide 3 examples of foods not shown in the picture above that are high in carbohydrates, fat, or protein. So we're talking about the picture of the plate there. Acceptable answers would have been something like muffins, honey, corn, sweet potato, peas, sugar and syrups, and fruit juice for carbohydrates. Perhaps for fats, butter, ice cream, avocado, peanut butter. I mean, these aren't an exhaustive list, so if you can think of others, then as long as they meet those 3 macronutrients criteria, then that's fine too. And protein, you could have protein bars, quinoa, or as it's properly called, quinoa, tofu, and cottage cheese. They would all be acceptable answers. Question 2, outline some sporting examples where recommended carbohydrate intake would exceed the levels recommended for a balanced diet. So in this instance, we're talking about athletes that do, like it says there, triathlons, marathons, swimming, anything that's like an ultra sort of endurance event. So the athletes will do something that's carbohydrate loading, whereby they will have a massive meal of pasta or rice or potatoes or something like that, something that contains a high amount of carbohydrates, as to increase the amount of carbohydrates stored in the body, in an effort to, I guess, stock up on energy. Think of it like filling your, trying to fill your fuel tank literally to the brim, instead of just where it clicks off and that's enough. It's like trying to fill your drink bottle right to the very top. That's what they're trying to do. They're literally trying to fill up on as much carbohydrates as possible. Perhaps athletes who are undertaking more than one training session would also need more carbohydrates in their diet. Again, because carbohydrates are the predominant fuel that is used. So there are some examples. Question 3, why would the food intake of competitors in a 20-kilometre run be very different from that of rugby players before and after? So the reason behind this is because we haven't looked at it yet, but the endurance athlete is going to be consuming foods. Actually, did we look at? No, we didn't. Foods that have a low GI or glycemic index. That is in your booklet. So this booklet, don't ask me about the picture, what happened to it, I don't know. So anyway, low glycemic index, so it provides energy at a more consistent rate. It's a slower release of energy. The endurance athlete is also going to be, consuming as much fluid, water, Powerade, Gatorade, whatever it might be prior to the event. The rugby player, they're going to have more of a diet that's high in protein to assist with any muscles that may have been, microscopically torn as a result of the event, the game, training session, whatever it might be. They will also, they won't be carbohydrate loading. They will probably have foods after the event that are that fall into the high GI category to restore any carbohydrates that have been lost as a result of the game. The marathon runner or the endurance athlete will also do that because the body is more, I guess, willing to accept the foods that are high GI, and it'll kickstart the whole recovery process. So there are your answers there. So looking at food as energy, I really feel like KFC now. That looks really good except for the pineapple on there. Nobody likes pineapple on pizzas. So food as energy, we've looked at before, okay, but everything that we eat, it gets broken down and it either gets used straight away or it gets stored for energy later on. Okay, we know that it allows for muscular contractions to occur. So there's different ways that happens, right? And this is what the picture here shows. So we've got fats that get broken down, and you know what they get broken down to because we've already talked about that. But there are different pathways that the energy systems take, or different pathways or different ways that the energy systems work in order to break down those fuels to provide ATP for muscular contraction. There's different waste products and all sorts of things. Okay, you don't need to. You used to need to have to know, what happened in things like the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle doesn't get examined anymore, but you'll probably, those of you that are doing biology, you'll learn about that. But you just need to understand this picture here in terms of what's happening. So I would be, looking at all of this sort of stuff here. Look at that, I'm drawing on the screen and hopefully it's working in PowerPoint. That's what I would be, committing to memory. Moving on. So the chemical fuels. We've talked about ATP. Okay, it stands for adenosine triphosphate. So tri meaning 3, and yeah, there's 3 phosphates. This fuel is the one that it's the most basic fuel. This is what happens. This is what's used for all muscular contractions. It doesn't matter whether it's using the the aerobic energy system, it doesn't matter whether it's using the anaerobic glycolysis system, they're all producing ATP. They just produce it at different rates. So, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And that's what it looks like. You have your adenosine, you have your 3 phosphates. So what happens is when muscular contractions occur, one of those phosphates, so let's say this phosphate here, he splits off, and there's a burst of energy, and the contraction happens, okay, which we'll see over here. And what happens is it now splits down into what's called adenosine diphosphate, or 2-phosphate. Don't know why. Don't ask me why it's called di and not bi, but it just is. So just go with it. So this bloke over here, he's broken off. You've got this burst of energy for muscular contraction. Okay, that's what M contraction is. I just didn't have the space to put muscular. Trouble with it is, though, that there's only enough energy for 2 to 3 seconds. Okay, but it's accessible really, really quickly. It is the fastest energy system in terms of supplying us with energy. Okay, but the downside of it is that it's also got to have time to replenish, which means that there's going to be longer periods of rest between exercise. Okay, so you can go flat out and run your 100 meters, but what's going to happen is you are going to have to eventually stop and rest, because the energy system needs time to replenish itself. Trying to move me out of the way, but it doesn't look like it's going to work. So how does it happen? We need to resynthesize the ATP. So we need to get that ATP, or the ADP. So we had your A, and we had a phosphate and a phosphate, and then we had another one over here. So we need to find a way that we can get this bloke to join back up here so it can become ATP again. All right, so let's try and get rid of all this stuff now. Doesn't want to do it. It's being awkward. And I'm getting a phone call now. So back again. Yeah, we were talking about ATP and how it's resynthesized. So in order for muscular contractions to keep occurring, there has to be a continual breakdown and replenishment, and that sort of process needs to keep going. So it's either the naturally occurring substance like phosphocreatine, which happens naturally within the body. You can also get creatine supplements to increase these stores, but it's a naturally occurring substance which gets replenished just through rest, and then there's also the breakdown of the nutrients that have been consumed, so your carbohydrates and your fats. So basically, to replenish the ATP, this PC molecule that we have, so we've got our ATP, we've got our adenosine, we've got our 3 phosphates, and then we've got this PC that's floating around the body as well. So the phosphocreatine, basically what happens is that phosphocreatine is used to join that floating phosphate, the one that broke off to provide energy. It acts on that floating acts on the floating phosphate to rejoin it to that ADP. Okay, so the breakdown of that PC, it creates another explosion, if you will, and then it's used to resynthesize that phosphate back, and then it forms ATP once again. Like I said previously, the advantage of this is it happens really, really quickly, and it can happen repeatedly as well. The trouble is that the body can only store limited amounts of PC. Okay, so there is a very quick depletion of these stores, which then means that the body will start finding other sources to replenish the ATP.
So first of all, what is energy? Energy is adenosine triphosphate, which is what I mentioned in a previous video. And you've got the adenosine molecule there with 3 phosphate molecules. Now, when you actually need energy for a muscular contraction, what happens is that phosphate at the end will break off and energy is released. So when you're exercising, basically what happens is over and over again, phosphates are breaking off ATP molecules. What it does form is an ADP molecule, which is adenosine diphosphate. The di means 2 because you've left over with 2 phosphate molecules. Now the problem is you can't really use that for energy, so the whole point of an energy system is to recreate the ATP. So to join phosphate molecules back onto the ADPs, so you can come up with lots of ATPs. So the ATP is the one that you need to create the energy, but you need to reconstruct that during an energy system, so you have more of them to use during muscular contraction. Obviously, there's other things that you would need ATP for, such as thinking. Just sitting there, you need it because obviously your digestive muscles are working as well. Any cellular process basically needs ATP, but for our causes, because we're doing an exercise course, we're just looking at muscular contraction.
So, fuels for the energy systems. So we've got glycogen. This is how the body stores glucose. It's a preferred energy source for exercise because it breaks down really quickly and it doesn't require as much, let's say, work or energy to do it. Okay, so the glycogen gets broken down by glycolysis. Okay, and each glucose molecule then gets split into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Okay. And the energy from this is what produces the ATP for muscular contractions. So this is where it gets a little bit, I guess, complicated, and there will be a sort of an explanation, a visual explanation in a bit. So under aerobic conditions, so that's when the body is able to use oxygen, the pyruvic acid, it enters mitochondria, and you've probably heard about mitochondria if you've done biology, and it undergoes what's called aerobic glycolysis, and then we get more ATP for muscular contractions to occur. But if you don't have oxygen available, because the aerobic energy system, it takes a long time to be the predominant energy supplier. It doesn't just like a light switch flick on and the body starts working aerobically. Even though you're breathing in oxygen the whole time, there's a bit of a delay. So if you're working at too high an intensity, or if the event that you're competing in, let's say it's a 400-meter event, there's not enough time for the oxygen to become the predominant supplier, you'll work anaerobically. So then what happens is the pyruvic acid gets converted into lactic acid and then into the lactate and hydrogen ions, which is the byproduct of the anaerobic glycolysis system. And if you've ever felt that, that burning in your legs, your legs feel like jelly and really weak, and they don't seem like they're working properly because you've been, running flat out for an extended period of time, that is that anaerobic glycolysis system working. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the screen, on this side here, if I can get my pen to work, on this side here, we have the oxygen being present. Okay, so if the oxygen's present, like I said, it enters the mitochondria, aerobic glycolysis happens, and as a result, we get our ATP molecules being rebuilt. Okay, and then that process keeps repeating until exercise stops, or the exercise intensity increases to a point that it's no longer able to supply the energy that's needed aerobically. In which case, we start working over here on our, let's say that's a really bad diamond, but on the diamond side. So the oxygen's not present, which means it gets broken down into pyruvic acid, and then it gets broken down into lactic acid, which then forms lactate and the hydrogen ions. Okay, but you also get your ATP as a result. But there are byproducts, and those byproducts then eventually cause the activity to, you have to slow down or you have to stop, one or the other. Whereas the oxygen, with the aerobic energy system, the byproducts, they don't inhibit or prevent the performance from occurring. So the byproducts for the aerobic energy system, which we'll find out later on, you've got your sweat. So you're losing sweat, which is essentially it's water. Okay, so you've got H2O as a byproduct. You've also got carbon dioxide, which you're breathing out as you're exercising. And finally, the other byproduct is heat. Okay, people, they get red in the face. That's the body heating up. That's all the blood coming closer to the surface of the skin, trying to cool the body down. So you've got your byproducts of heat, H2O or water, and carbon dioxide. So they're those byproducts. So fuels continued. At rest, even at rest, you're using energy. Okay, the bodies prefer to use fats. Okay, but like I said earlier, depending on the activity, it's going to change. Okay, so at maximal exercise, because it uses less energy to break down carbohydrates, and they also break down quicker. The body prefers to use carbohydrates. At submaximal exercise, so we're not talking flat out. I just drew on my screen. Whoops. At submaximal exercise, we're using a combination of carbohydrates, fats, and, proteins. Even though I said it's not a preferred energy supply, it can be, right? In emergency situations, if you remember that. So this is a contribution of each, dependent on the activity. So at rest, you'll use 1/3 of carbohydrates, you'll use 2/3 of fats. Okay. At submaximal exercise, so we're talking less than 85% of your max heart rate. Okay, you'll use your carbohydrates, your fat, and some proteins. Okay, and then finally I'll get my head out of the way, maximal exercise, so we're talking greater than 85% of your maximum heart rate. If you remember your maximum heart rate, to calculate it, which you should know, is what? Yep. If I can write it, it is 220 minus your age. So for me, because I'm getting old, let's just make it nice and easy. I'm almost 40. My maximum heart rate would be 180 beats per minute. That doesn't even look like an M. That's terrible. M. That's even worse, but you get the gist. Okay, so 220 minus your age. You need to know that formula. Okay, commit it to memory. And then you need to be able to work out a percentage of your heart rate too. Okay, PE, yes, it has, but it's not a huge amount. Carbohydrates, they're used as the fuel. They get a contribution rate of like 55–60% of your dietary intake. Okay, so they're stored as, we've already been through that. Okay, they get stored in the muscles and liver. When the stores begin to deplete, the fats become the predominant supplier of energy. So people who run endurance events, they will try to use fats earlier on in the race, because when the intensity gets up there and they need to sprint to finish the race or whatever it might be, then they want to have carbohydrates still left over to use. Okay, so the amounts that carbohydrates get used, or how much is required, it varies. Okay, so people like endurance athletes, they'll have a diet that's high in carbohydrates. Your marathon runners, your cyclists, let's pick on Mr. Green, triathletes. Okay, he's not really a triathlete. No, he is. I better not say that. So during exercise, carbohydrates are the preferred fuel. Okay, like I've said, because they require less oxygen to break down, but they also produce the same amounts of energy. Okay, the carbohydrates consumed prior to the event, it needs to be thought about. Okay, if you're going to be doing an event that's 2 hours or longer, okay, you need to be filled to the brim. Okay, so that's that carbohydrate loading that we talked about earlier. It's like filling your drink bottle right to the top. It's filling the car right to the top when petrol's cheap. Okay, those sort of things. You've got for anaerobic exercise, predominantly you will use your carbohydrates. Okay, if we're talking aerobic exercise, so it's your moderate intensity, but it's a longer duration, you'll use your carbohydrates, and then you'll use fats. Okay, if you're doing any sort of long duration activity, okay, you need to have more carbohydrates. So probably around 80% of the dietary intake would be the number that you would be looking at. Okay, because again, this reason, where is it? They require less oxygen, okay, but they produce the same amount of energy. All right, so that's the reason why. So fats, 25–30%. We've already gone through that. All right, they're crucial. Doesn't matter whether you're an athlete or not. Okay. They're used as a medium to transport your vitamins and minerals around the body. Okay. Vitamins A, D, E, and K, they're the ones that are important. Like we said, they get stored in the fat cells, adipose tissue, and in the skeletal muscle. Okay. Fat gets broken down a little bit differently. Like we said, they get broken down to free fatty acids, and the breakdown is really slow. Okay, but they can provide us with more energy. Okay, it uses a lot more oxygen to break down compared to the glycogen goes. All right, I want you to have a go at the exam question, and then we'll come back. Okay, so hopefully you've had a go at responding to that question. It's worth 3 marks. Okay, so you should have had something along those lines. Okay, this was my response that I had. Primary fuel source at rest. The reason for this is they produce most ATP. However, during high intensity exercise, takes too much oxygen to break down the ATP, so less relied on when compared to carbohydrates. So there are some examples of what you should have said, provided. So, protein as a fuel. Like I've said it a few times before, protein is primarily used for the growth and repair of tissues. It's working out in the gym and going for runs and those sort of things, you'll have these microscopic tears in your muscles, and as they repair themselves, the muscle grows back bigger, stronger. It's not like a torn hamstring or those sort of things. They're only just microscopic tears within the individual muscle fibers itself. It's more, let's say it's like a stretching. So protein is primarily used to fix that. So that's why athletes will have, like bodybuilders and weightlifters and those sort of people will have diets that are high in protein. Okay. Like I've said a few times before, in extreme circumstances, it can be used as a fuel source. And like you're going to see in this video here, it's being used in an extreme case. So if we look at this video, this is the, I believe, the final of the World Championships triathlon a few years back. And this guy is actually in first place at the moment. But you can see that he's used absolutely everything that he has. If you probably asked him, where are you? He wouldn't know. He can't even stand. He can't run. So here's his brother helping him along. He's actually just been passed for the first place. So there goes the gold medal. But he was so close. He was spent. Absolutely spent. Would have been using protein as a fuel source. You'll see at the end here when he crosses the finish line, he just collapses.
Is he allowed to help his brother? Is that part of the rules? I'm not too sure. We've never seen anything like this before.
Unbelievable scenes. Unbelievable scenes in Cozumel. To finish in second and third, can hardly stand. And Alistair is having to drag him across the line and pushing him home for second.
You can see, absolutely spent, got nothing left.
Goodness me.
So yeah, protein as a fuel source. Like I said, look up Hawaiian Ironman or something along those lines, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, the carbohydrates versus fats as a fuel mixture. Okay, like we said, glycogen, it's the preferred fuel source because it's broken down quickly. It doesn't use as much oxygen, so on and so forth. The longer duration events, the fats are the preferred source, but the fats require more oxygen to break down the fatty acids. So the sooner we can do this, the sooner we can train our body to do it. Okay, it means that we can use the carbohydrates later on in the race or the event or whatever we're doing when the intensity gets to that, that higher level. So the body can work at that higher intensity for longer. So if we had two people and, we're talking about them doing the same event, but one person has trained their body to use the fats predominantly, at an earlier point in time, it means that towards the end of the race, when the intensity increases, let's say in that last kilometer, the person who's trained their body to use the fats earlier on has more carbohydrate stores, which means they're able to work at a higher intensity than that other person. So, the person who's got has used the fats predominantly earlier on might be at this level, and then the person who's already used up a lot of their carbohydrates might be at this level. So then the other person who's trained there using the fat stores, they can go to the next level again, and then the person who's used most of their carbohydrates, they can only go so far here. So there's all this distance here where the person who's trained the fats is able to accelerate off. Okay, so they'll be able to finish the race much quicker compared. So you need to know this whole crossover concept. Okay, it's a theoretical one, but it explains, the use of fats and carbohydrates. So essentially what they're talking about is there is a crossover point. Okay, so here and here, whereby the body switches from using fats and carbohydrates. Okay, you can, like I said, train it. It's one of those things that you're able to modify. Teach your body to use fats earlier on. If you want to have a look, there's a link in the notes here that you can have a look at and do some more reading. So our fats as a fuel source, they're a really good energy source. Okay, if you look here, the maximum ATP per molecule, so per one molecule of one molecule will produce 36 hold on, sorry, another phone call. So we're talking about molecules. Okay, so one glucose molecule will essentially produce 36 ATP. Okay, whereas one molecule of fat will produce about, it says there 441. It could be more, it could be less. So there's heaps more that is produced by fats. Okay, but, and that was the big but, it requires more oxygen to break it down, okay, which takes longer. So once the body has used its stores of glycogen, hypoglycemia sets in. So, diabetics, you would have heard them saying they're having a hypo moment. So hypoglycemia is the deficiency of glucose in the bloodstream, which is easily fixed. How do we fix it? We eat sugary lollies, those sort of things. Endurance athletes will use farts. Somebody's modified my PowerPoint. Thank you to whoever did that back in 2018. So endurance athletes will train to use fats earlier on, not farts, but farts could probably help you as well, produce you. Oh no, there we go. Someone's changed. Right. Funny. By increasing the number of mitochondria in the body, it increases the amount of energy that can be produced, which when we undertake our aerobic training, this is essentially what we're doing. Okay. The trouble is that the fats, they come as a cost. Okay. They can produce more. So if you see there, the oxygen required in liters per mole of ATP produced, it requires 5.5 liters of oxygen to break down the molecule of fat, whereas it only requires 3.5 liters of oxygen to break down the glucose. So the glycemic index, I spoke about that earlier. Okay, it's a ranking system. Back again. Hi Ali, that's the reason I stopped. You sent me your email. So the glycemic index, it's a ranking system. It's basically, it ranks foods as in terms of how quickly they release the sugars, the glucose into the bloodstream. Okay, so the quicker that it happens, the higher the ranking on the GI. Okay, so traditionally carbohydrates, they get divided into two categories. They get divided into, anyone know? Doesn't work like that. So it's complex and simplex, or simple and complex, whichever way you want to look at it. So you've got sugars and starches. Okay, but a little while ago, they devised a different system, and that was called the glycemic index. So Food that scores 55 or less, it's considered low GI. Food that scores 70 or higher, it's considered high GI. So you would have heard those terms, thrown around quite a bit with breakfast cereals and those sort of things. You may have even seen the adverts years and years ago. Okay, so it's based on how quickly the food gets digested and the energy is released, and then also how it affects the glucose levels within the blood. So foods that get digested rapidly, they're considered high GI, and then they are things like your honey and your sugars, your potatoes. These ones are the ones that you would use after exercise, okay, because they give you that quick sugar burst and make you feel normal again. Sorry, coronavirus. Foods that take longer are considered to be low GI. So they're your, wholemeal pasta, your sweet potatoes, your quinoa or quinoa. So, those foods, they provide the glucose slowly throughout the day, the event, whatever it might be, without that, that massive sugar hit that people get.
Right, class, so picking up on yesterday's exercises with the addition and subtraction of fractions. 6/9.
When kids don't have breakfast in the morning, things can get a bit fuzzy in the classroom. But research shows that a nutritious breakfast, like great tasting Sultana bran, with filling fibre and whole grains, can help kids stay focused.
We add or subtract.
Kellogg Sultana bran. Fight the fuzzies at school.
So you may have seen those sort of things, or those ads. So they release their energy. If we were to draw a graph, it would look something like high GI, you get this massive spike and then it goes down really quick, whereas low GI kind of looks like the aerobic energy system, goes up really slowly throughout the day and peaks and then sort of tails off. Okay, so it releases its energy at a much slower, more consistent rate. So they're the ones that we said earlier on that you would need to,
right, class.
I want to skip that, prior to your long distance events, okay, because they release their energy a lot slower. So here's some common foods and how they rank on the glycemic index. So you can see the difference in foods. The oranges, baked beans, chocolate milk, low-fat yogurts, they all have a relatively low glycemic index. Some that are obviously higher than others, which would almost put them into that moderate glycemic index. Okay, and then you've got your high GI foods, which give you that real quick sugar hit, your orange juice, bananas, sports drinks, jelly beans, all the stuff that you're not supposed to eat all the time. So have a look at that picture. Which ones do you think would fit in the low GI and which ones do you think would fit in the high GI? Have a go at it and then we'll come back. No, I'm still here. I didn't pause it. All right. High GI. You probably said things like the snakes, the Coke, the Powerade, or the Gatorade, or whatever the hell that bottle is, and the donuts. Did you say anything else? No. Maybe the corn would be the low GI, the baked beans. What did we leave out? The cake. Okay, so hopefully you got most of those right. So the glycemic index. Because the fats and proteins that don't contain carbohydrates, they're considered low GI foods. Okay, GI ranks how quickly the food's absorbed. Foods that are high in fiber are also considered low GI, and then the sports drinks and the foods, they're considered high GI because they're absorbed quickly. They raise the glucose levels really quick because of the chemicals that are contained within each of those. The energy systems. All right, I am going to take a pause for some lunch, and then I'm going to come back and talk about the energy systems. So the energy systems. I know we've been talking about them already. Well, we've been talking about the fuel side of things. Now we've got to talk about the actual energy side of things and how they work during activity and help us to do what we do. Okay, so you need to, I guess, use all of the resources that are available to you. Like I said, if you're watching this, then we're not back at school yet. So I guess hopefully my explanation of this in the video will be sufficient. If it's not, then you're going to have to consult, and I would be consulting things like Ed Rollo. Definitely use that. Your textbook. Try and do as much reading on the internet if you can. Try as many practice exams as you can, because if you can understand it, then it's going to make things a lot easier down the track, because from here on in, the energy systems, they keep popping up, and you have to relate what you're talking about back to the energy systems. Things like training, responses to exercise, all that sort of stuff. It's all tied in with the energy system. So from this point forward, I guess you need to be switched on. I mean, you've needed to be switched on already, but it's where it can get a little. If you've done biology, then you're already a step of the way. Okay, so the characteristics of the energy systems is, you need to understand it. Okay, it's not like a light switch. Okay, all three energy systems, they're working together constantly. Okay, it just depends on sort of what percentage of what energy system is being used. Are we using more ATP and less of the oxygen, or are we using more of the oxygen and less of the ATP? It depends. Okay, but that process is what we call interplay. So if you've had a look through through the stuff that I have left you guys on Teams, I have given you that. Okay, that booklet is literally the last almost 10 years of exam questions from VCAR. It goes through, and I went through all of the exams from almost the last 10 years, and anytime interplay was mentioned, I took the question, I put it into that booklet. So use it, don't use it. I am strongly suggesting that you err on the side of using it, okay? Because the questions, if you look at that book, the questions don't really change that much, all right? The wording might differ. The example that they use will differ, but it's still asking you about interplay. You just need to apply it to that scenario. I'm more than happy to, if you if you want to do the booklet and you want to email it back to me, you can email it back to me. It's probably going to be a little bit difficult to do that because I've just literally copied it and I've done screenshots of the questions, so you won't actually be able to type anything in there. How would I do it? Maybe what you could do is type up your responses and send me the document either via Teams or via email, and I'd be happy to look at the questions and mark them for you. If you have access to a scanner, then print the book out, write the questions, write the answers to the questions, scan it, and then email it to me as a PDF. We'll figure out a way, I guess. Anyway, back to this. So they all start working together at the start of any activity. Okay, they're all doing their bits and pieces dependent on a number of things, and those factors that determine what's going to be predominantly supplying the energy are things like the duration, the intensity, oxygen being present or not, the depletion of food and chemical fuels. So at any point any one of those things can actually change, and then it will ultimately change which energy system is supplying the energy. So if we look at our little graph there, okay, you can see that initially at the start and even throughout, there is still some contribution by all of the energy systems. You know, if we look at the start here, if we draw a line there, you know, you can see that whilst the ATP is diminishing, okay, it is still supplying some, and it only might be a tiny, tiny little bit, but it is still supplying some energy. The other two systems are becoming more dominant in how much energy they're providing. So the anaerobic glycolysis system, so it's not called the lactic acid system, it's anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, this is an old picture. I can't remember where I got it from. Actually, no, it's in your textbook. So it's wrong. Anaerobic glycolysis system. So that graph is on page 119, if you want to have a look at it. But you can see that the anaerobic glycolysis system is starting to provide more energy. It hasn't quite peaked yet, okay, but it is getting close to its sort of peak time for energy production. And finally, the aerobic energy system is slowly increasing and becoming more and more predominant. All right, so at that point there, all three energy systems are still supplying. You know, if we move further down and look at 150-ish seconds, okay, the anaerobic glycolysis system is still supplying, okay, but it's nowhere near as much as the aerobic energy system. The ATP-PC system has actually stopped, let's say not stopped contributing, okay, but it's not showing up on the radar. And the reason being is because that system requires the activity to stop in order for it to replenish its phosphocreatine stores. So, like we've just said, they all contribute in some way, shape, or form. Okay. At rest, we're using the aerobic energy system because the intensity is not, it's not high enough to warrant using any other system. The supply of energy is more than adequate to meet the demand. All right, so we'll look at, you know, supply and demand and oxygen debt and deficit a little bit later on. But as the demand increases, the predominant energy system is going to change. Okay, so if I was to, you know, jump up and then start, you know, doing star jumps and whatever else, then that's going to change which energy system is going to be used. So if we look at the graph here, okay, and again, it varies. You can see that it varies. Okay, there's no, I guess, rule in terms of what it has to use. Okay, but you know, we've got, I don't know what's going on there. Okay, I'm just making my picture bigger. In the first couple of seconds of activity, you're going to be using your ATP stores. Okay, the ones that are actually stored within the muscles. Okay, and if it's a maximal effort, so we're, you know, talking about me opening the door right now and sprinting across to the other side of the wall from the gym office door. Okay, that would take me probably about, I reckon I'm quick, a second. Let's be generous. Let's say 3 seconds. Okay, because it's taken 3 seconds, it's used those stores in my muscles. Okay, but if I was to run from one end of the gym to the other end of the gym, that's going to take me a little bit longer. So I would be using the ATP, but I would also be using some phosphocreatine stores. Okay, and then you can see the rest of the graph as it goes. At rest, rest is, you know, how long's a piece of string? I could sit here all day if I really wanted to, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go home and do some more work at home, look after my kids, so on and so forth. The dominant energy system there is going to be the aerobic system, because the demand it's not that great. Okay, I can't get rid of the picture. Well, that's just annoying. Okay, well, I'm going to have to move on. So at rest, we're able to supply the energy required by utilizing that aerobic energy system. Okay, we can also supply enough energy at submaximal intensities using that same energy system as well. Okay, but if we increase that intensity too much and the aerobic energy system isn't able to supply it anymore, then the body will change the fuel supply. It will change the energy system as well. So let's say we've been running a marathon, you know, and we've been quite comfortable. We've been working using our aerobic energy system at this level here, right? But in the last couple of 100 meters, our intensity increases to up here, right? This point here is the point at which the body is no longer able to work aerobically. Okay, so what happens is in this area here, we start working anaerobically. So then we start using our carbohydrates and we start producing lactic acid. So in that last sort of 100, 200 meters of the race, our legs start getting really, really heavy. You know, they start burning. We start getting more and more tired. That's what we're talking about. The energy systems work sort of in unison together. Okay. If that was to, you know, drop back down to this level here, and we dropped intensity. Let's say we were, you know, sprinting to pass someone. Maybe the race hadn't finished just yet. Okay, but someone had challenged us and we're like, okay, well, I need to go with them. So we start working at that intensity. We work into the anaerobic zone, but then, you know, it drops back down when that person realizes they're not going to break away from us. They haven't broken us. You know, we can drop our intensity and the body will go back to working aerobically. You know, the body will do its best to remove the lactic acid. Okay, it will take time, but that's what will happen. So our ATP PC system, okay, this is the one that doesn't actually use any food fuels. Okay, it uses those chemical fuels which are stored within the body to replenish that ATP. Okay, it's released really quickly. Like I said, sprinting from the one side of the gym or one end of the gym to the other. Okay, at about 5 seconds. So it's only a really short duration that this system works for. The PC stores are at about 50%. Okay, now these are the numbers that you need to remember as well when responding to exam questions, because you have to use data. So at that point, when there's about 50% of your energy stores of the ATP system, the anaerobic glycolysis system is starting to kick in and starting to become more and more and more effective. Okay, at the point that the fuel stores from the ATP PC system are completely exhausted, okay, it's going to take about 3 minutes. Okay, and 3 minutes will get you to, I think it's about 90–95%. Okay, but it has to be passive recovery. So when we talk about active and we talk about passive recovery is that sitting down, not doing anything. because if you're up walking around, you're still going to be using your ATP because you're walking. So there's muscular contractions happening. So 3 minutes of passive recovery to replenish those PC stores, and then you can go again. It takes about, I think it's about 5 minutes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes to actually replenish 100% of those stores. So here's our little, process of everything. But you can see you've got your, at the top here at 12 o'clock, your muscle stores of ATP, they're ready. You've got a movement that's initiated. The ATP loses one of its phosphates. You get your muscle contracting. You've got the ADP building as ATP diminishes. And then finally your PC stores are broken down to replenish that ATP. And then it goes again in that circle. The anaerobic glycolysis system is a little bit more complicated. ATP, pretty simple. That circle that we looked at before, that was the entire process. Okay, whereas the anaerobic glycolysis system, or lactic acid, it releases energy, but there's not a complete breakdown of the glucose because the oxygen isn't present to do it. So the ATP is different to the anaerobic glycolysis system because it actually relies on a food fuel being broken down. Okay, so the glycogen that we've consumed, or the carbohydrates that then get stored as glycogen, get broken down through a process called glycolysis. And I'm just itching my leg, that's why I'm disappearing out of the screen. So there isn't enough oxygen to break down the glycogen completely, and as a result you get the lactic acid or the lactate, and the hydrogen ions build up and up and up, which are the byproducts of that system. And it's actually the hydrogen ions that inhibit the muscular contractions. For many years it was assumed that it was the lactic acid that caused that problem, but it's actually the hydrogen ions. Okay, similar to the ATP-PC, it gets activated at the start of activity. If you refer to that graph that we looked at on page 119, you'll see all three energy systems start working at the commencement of activity, but it just takes a little bit longer for the lactic acid system to kick in. Okay, at about that 5 to 15 second mark, it reaches its peak, and 2 to 3 minutes is where the lactate, the hydrogen ions, they've built up to the point that they're beginning to inhibit performance. Okay, and if the activity continues at that same sort of intensity, then the aerobic energy system will have had enough time to kick in to become that predominant supplier of energy. Okay, another term that you need to know is the lactate inflection point, or LIP. So that's the point at which the body is unable to prevent the buildup of hydrogen ions in the working muscles. So at this point, those levels rise really quickly, and that point is known as the onset of blood lactate, which we'll look at in a little bit. Finally, the aerobic energy system. Okay, it's the slowest of all the systems. If you wanted to think of it like a car, it would be the big prime mover, one of those grocery delivery trucks. Okay, you might have this tiny weeny little sports car that maybe has all the power in the world and it really quick off the lights. Okay, but it's only got this really tiny little fuel tank, and because it's so powerful, it drains its fuel really quick. Okay, then you've got let's say your station wagon, your family wagon. Okay, where it's got that mix of power, but it also has a longer range sort of fuel tank. Okay, so it's a little bit slower than that sports car, but it's able to go for longer. Okay, its fuel tank lasts that little bit longer, you can go further, and then you've got this prime mover that has this abundance of energy, but it's really slow, it's really heavy, but when it gets going, it can keep going. It's, you know, the fuel supplies are just massive. Okay, but like I said, it's the most complex. There's a lot of stuff that's got to happen in order to produce the amount of ATP that it does. And you remember that table that we looked at, you know, depending on which food fuel you're using, if you're using fats or carbohydrates, it can produce either 400 ATP molecules or 30 molecules, you know, as opposed to the ATP PC system, which can only make 1 ATP. Okay, it also starts at the beginning of the activity, like we said, all 3 start, but it just takes longer to get to that peak. So after about, you know, the 2 to 3 minutes after the lactic acid or the anaerobic glycolysis system has been working, then that system's starting to, you know, if we're talking in terms of graphs and peaks and that sort of stuff, that's starting to become the predominant one. That's the one that's starting to peak. Okay, and it'll keep producing energy as long as the heart rate stays lower than that 85%. You know, how long can you keep going for? If you could keep supplying your body with fuel indefinitely, it would keep supplying you with fuel to compete at that level. So how it works, it's in stages. Okay, stage 1, the fats, the carbohydrates are broken down and small amounts of energy are released. Okay, at stage 2, we get our pyruvic acid. When the glucose doesn't get broken down, it enters the Krebs cycle. You don't need to know the Krebs cycle, you just need to know that it enters the Krebs cycle. And so if you think back to that picture that was drawn, you know, a few slides back at the start, go back to that. Or if you want to look at it in terms of your textbook, it is on page 111. So you don't need to know what the Krebs cycle is or how it works, you just need to know what it's called. Okay, if though you have oxygen that's present, so the energy system has been working for some time and that intensity is low enough, then the pyruvic acid gets broken down, okay, and it produces a waste product, which is carbon dioxide, okay? And then in the Krebs cycle, we're able to produce more ATP for exercise to continue. Then finally at stage 3, this is where the most ATP is produced, and all those, the byproducts are broken down, you know, the pyruvic acid by the Krebs cycle. You get water, you get heat. So the water comes from when you sweat, the heat comes from because, you know, your muscles are doing stuff, your body gets hot. You know, they're the byproducts, so they're not ones that are going to harm your performance. The cycle continues. So, you know, like if we were to look at that ATP circle, it would look something like, you know, that again. I'm not going to put in all the, you know, the different things, but you get the gist. The process keeps going around and round and round until we get bored or we run out of fuel. So on page 125, 126, you have a comparison of all 3 of the systems. What I've put in is literally just a summary of those tables to try and fit it in on one slide for you. There is more information in that table. Okay, so I would be looking at that table, but in terms of what you need to know for the exams and for SACs, this is probably sufficient. Okay, so you can see the fuel source, you can see the intensities, you can see the dominance of the duration, you can see the total system duration. So the difference between the dominance and the total system duration is the point at which let's use the ATP as an example. The ATP system, ATP PC system might go for 10 seconds, or the numbers vary. It could be 10, it could be 30. Okay, it depends on what you're reading, but as a rule, 10 seconds, okay, is when it's predominantly going to be, you know, falling away, right? But it's going to be at its peak at about 1 to 5. The anaerobic glycolysis system between 5 and 60 seconds, and then the aerobic system, further on. The ATP system, it's really cool because it doesn't actually have any byproducts, okay? But it doesn't produce much. So the amount of ATP it produces is 0.7 of molecule. Okay, whereas if we look at the oxygen or the aerobic system, 338 per glucose molecule and 441 per triglyceride molecule. So there's a lot more, but that's just a summary. Okay, so we're moving on to how all the 3 energy systems work together with energy system interplay. So moving on, like I said, they all start working. All 3 energy systems, the ATP-PC, the anaerobic glycolysis system, and the aerobic system, they all start working together at the start of the activity. It just depends on the intensity of the activity in terms of how quickly fuels are depleted and energy systems start working and so on and so forth. So some of them start quicker than others. Right?
This car you're
Look at a
familiar
Top
with,
Gear example.
the Bugatti Veyron. This car you're familiar with, the Bugatti Veyron. The Concorde hands 1,000 horsepower and a top speed of 252 miles an hour. But spin the clock back 15 years, and in the 1990s, this was the ultimate road car. The McLaren F1.
Like the Bugatti, the McLaren is an orgy of mind-bending numbers. It was the fastest with a top speed of 240 miles an hour. It was the most expensive, costing £500,000 in 1993. And like the Bugatti, the McLaren was built utterly without compromise. The engine bay was lined with gold, because gold is the best heat reflector. An entirely new and unique gearbox had to be developed because no existing gearbox could survive the torque from the 6.1-litre BMW engine. It was the first carbon fibre bodied car.
But although these cars have so much in common, the McLaren and the Veyron are actually poles apart.
Whereas the Veyron is loaded with technology, the McLaren gets nothing. No traction control, no ABS. Its gizmo cupboard is completely bare. The F1's creator wanted his machine to be just the greatest, the purest driving machine, in the same way the Bugatti's creator wanted it to be the most amazing technical achievement. And that shines through in the way they feel. Changing gear, it's like sliding the bolt action forwards on a rifle, that well-oiled, mechanical, metallic feel.
And you sit slap bang in the middle for that racing driver sensation.
Oh dear Lord. Okay, what I shall do now is climb out of the McLaren F1 and get into the Bugatti Veyron. Not a bad day, this one, so far. Right, to business.
Because for the first time ever, these titans will now go head-to-head in a 1-mile drag race. I shall be in the Veyron. And in the McLaren, a man who has no idea that he's about to make history.
He is quite excited though. He saw his first camel today.
Actually, I'm quite glad it's him in that car, because today that McLaren is worth £2 million. If we do come together though, he does know the drill. Run and meet at the border. Nearly ready. On paper, the Bugatti's got it. I've got 1,000 horsepower, 370 more than the McLaren, but the McLaren weighs less, so it's got more power to weight. 0 to 60, The Bugatti should have... I don't know, this is the real world. We'll have to see what happens.
3, 2, 1, go!
Yes, this is it. Forward into history. What? How is that happening? How is that happening? The old Pretender is still there. It won't give up its crown. Isn't that doing 240 kilometers an hour? Come on, Bugatti. We're going to give a William in. 1,000 horsepower. There's no way past that. I'm going to take it. Yes! 300 kilometers an hour. 320 kilometers an hour. Yes! 320, and I have clearly taken it. The Bugatti takes the prize.
So, the idea behind that wasn't just to put in a drag race of two really fast cars. The idea of it was to show you guys the difference in the energy systems. Now, I think of the McLaren, which is, I mean, it might be an older car, but it's probably much lighter. It doesn't have four-wheel drive as well. So think of the McLaren as the ATP PC system. Okay, it gets off to a really quick start, supplies us with a lot of energy. The Bugatti, four-wheel drive. Four-wheel drives are really hard to get off the line. It's probably much heavier. Okay, there is a whole heap more gear in that car. So it starts off slowly. But then gradually, as time goes by, it gets faster and faster and faster and faster, and eventually it overtakes the McLaren. Whilst the McLaren's still, you know, keeping up, it's falling further and further behind as the Bugatti's getting further and further ahead, which would be like the Bugatti being the aerobic energy system. So it starts to supply most of the energy for the activity, whatever it might be, dependent on, you know, how long the event goes for. If we were looking at something like a 100-meter sprint and we were using those two cars as the example, then the McLaren would be supplying the majority of the energy for that activity. But if we were looking at something a lot longer, and I would say that was probably, you know, something like a 1.6k drag race or something. I don't know the exact distance, but the Bugatti had the time to build up its speed and eventually take over. So, like we said, some of them are able to start quicker than others. Okay, they don't work sequentially. They're not like a light switch where you just flick it on and flick it off and change in between energy systems, but they don't work like that. Okay, if you look at the graph over on the side here, these are the contributions for the energy systems for a 200-meter sprint. Okay, so the first graph is the 5-second stage, and then the second graph, the one down the bottom, is the 20-second stage for the sprint. Okay, you can see the difference between the two. The stored ATP and PC, they equate to like almost 70% of the energy supplied at that 5-second interval, whereas at the 20-second stage of the race, stored ATP has decreased to 2%, the PC is down to 31%, and the anaerobic glycolysis system is starting to take over as the predominant energy system for that point in the race. And the aerobic energy system, again, is also starting to supply more and more energy. And you can see my son behind me. Wavecade, he's doing his schoolwork too. So if we look at the text here. Okay, this is found in your textbooks on page 129. It says that netball is characterized by repeated bouts of high intensity action interspersed with periods of moderate activity, rest periods during play stoppages. So all three start contributing, okay, at the start. In the first 3 to 5 seconds, ATP is supplying most of the energy, but the anaerobic glycolysis system is also working at the same time, but there's more work involved in breaking down the chemicals, so it takes longer. If the person, you know, continues to run up and down the netball court greater than 85% for longer than that, sort of that 10 seconds, then they're going to be running out of power from the PC system. So the anaerobic glycolysis system will start working more in terms of providing the power for the energy for the contractions to keep occurring. They're not going to get a break during that quarter, so there won't be the opportunity for the PC stores to replenish, because remember, the PC stores, they require 3 minutes to replenish, was it 90%, 95%? Okay, but because they're not getting that rest, they're not rebuilding, which means the anaerobic glycolysis system keeps working. They keep producing that lactic acid. So during this whole thing, the aerobic system, it's only going to be providing like little bits of energy, okay? But it's going to be providing more and more energy during the rest time, okay? Because it's replenishing the stores of the PC because it's resting. But if the event keeps going longer and longer, it will eventually produce more and more. However, it's that intensity in the netball that keeps the aerobic energy system from being that predominant supplier of energy, because netball it's all about, you know, short, sharp movements, running up and down the court, depending on obviously the position that you play as well. So, you know, if you look at the last line there, the 2-minute stage of contributions, you might have 25% ATP PC, anaerobic glycolysis 15%, and the aerobic 60%. So the majority of it is going to come from, you know, those stoppages. And also it depends, so dependent on that intensity as well. If we look at the marathon, which is on the next slide, it's going to be completely different again. So because the marathon goes for that, you know, much longer period of time, all three systems are going to start, okay, but it's going to be at a lot slower rate. So if we're comparing that netball center and our marathon runner, the PC stores are going to be used a lot slower because it's not a flat out sprint at the start. Okay, so they will last longer in duration and they won't peak till later on. It says 8 to 10 seconds there. The anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic systems, they're going to be working as well. Okay, but again, it's going to be later on down in the event. Predominantly, for the majority of the event, the aerobic energy system is going to be the main supplier of energy, because of the intensity, because of the duration of the event. Okay, like it says, any surges where it's above that 85%, the anaerobic glycolysis system will kick in, okay, and it will become the predominant supplier at that point in time. So we'll look at the difference between dominant and predominant a little bit later on. Yeah, so we'll look at predominant and dominant, but Oh, do you know what? Let's cover it now. So at any given point in time, okay, so let's say we're looking at, 5 minutes into the marathon. So it's only been running 5 minutes. But at that point in time, they're just cruising along. They're doing their thing, okay? They're not stressing themselves because they've got another 2 hours ahead of them. The predominant energy system at that point in time, like if we took a photo of that moment in time, we would say was the aerobic energy system, okay? On the flip side, let's go towards the end of the race, right? We've been going for, let's say, just over 2 hours. Okay, we're coming up to the finish line. There's a bit of competition for a place just up ahead. There's someone who might be, let's say, 50, maybe 100 meters off in the distance. Could be the difference between gold and silver. Okay. The person coming second, they start a flat out sprint. Okay. They're using the last of their energy stores as a flat out sprint to try and catch that person to make up the difference between the gold and the silver. So if we took a photo of that moment in time, you would say that the predominant energy system at that time was the anaerobic system, the anaerobic glycolysis system. Okay, so predominant is looking at like snapshots in time, whereas the dominant energy system is looking at the big picture. Okay, so the dominant energy system for the marathon would be the aerobic energy system. So if you look at the last couple of lines there, the 5 second stage contribution might be ATP 80%, anaerobic 15%, 5%. Then if we look at 1 hour, the ATP is gone completely. Okay, and the reason being is because the marathon is a continuous event, it hasn't had time to replenish its stores, because remember, you've got to have that passive rest for it to replenish. The anaerobic glycolysis system might be doing about 5%, and the reason that's so low as well is because the intensity is probably well under that 85% maximum heart rate. Okay, so the aerobic energy system is able to do the majority of the work quite easily. Okay, if we were to, like I said before, start a sprint to try and catch a person, then you would find the difference between the anaerobic glycolysis and the aerobic systems, they would change. So let's have a look at this video here, which hopefully explains dominant and predominant a little bit better.
Hi, this is Jason from Activate Ed, and this is the next of our VCE Phys Ed video podcasts. So in this video, we're going to talk specifically about interplay of energy systems during a sprint finish in an endurance type event. So what we're watching here is the 10,000 metres from the Sydney Olympics in 2000. So these guys have been going for over 25 minutes now. So it's safe to assume that the predominant energy system here is the aerobic system. Oxygen uptake levels will be well and truly sufficient for the aerobic system to be meeting a majority of the energy demands. So that lap was a 63-second lap, so 63 seconds for 400 metres. And if you looked back through all the previous laps, what you'd see is that the lap times sort of sat between 63 and 65 seconds. So we're just going to let this play for a bit, and then we're going to have a chat about the last lap. So as I come to the finishing post, you'll see another split time. It's about 65 seconds, so the speed's been fairly constant throughout. Once they get onto the last lap here, we're going to see a significant increase in intensity. and the additional ATP required for that higher intensity is going to come from anaerobic glycolysis, and that's because the aerobic system is unable to respond immediately to a change in intensity. And that's because oxygen uptake, heart rate, respiratory rate, tidal volume, stroke volume, all of those things associated with oxygen uptake can't respond immediately. They take time to increase. So you can see they're really sprinting now. The aerobic system here is still predominant, but anaerobic glycolysis is providing the additional ATP required to run at this higher speed. Big sprint finish and a really close finish. So what we can see here is that the last lap was a 56-second lap, considerably faster than the previous laps. And in fact, if you had looked at it even more closely, what you'd see is the last 200 metres was roughly 26 seconds, and that is a seriously quick 200 metres, particularly at the end of 10,000 metres. So it's really important to understand that despite that increase in intensity, the aerobic system is still the predominant supplier of ATP. The anaerobic glycolysis system is providing the additional ATP required to work at that higher intensity, and it needs to do that because the aerobic system is reliant on the delivery of oxygen. And heart rate, respiratory rate, stroke volume, tidal volume, all of those things that assist us in delivering more oxygen to working muscles can't respond or can't increase immediately to the level that we require. They increase more gradually. And so in the meantime, anaerobic glycolysis helps us out with the extra ATP. So I hope that's been really useful. Stay tuned for our future podcasts. Hi, this is Jason
All right, so let's look at some other terms that you're going to need to know for the exam. We've got oxygen deficit and steady state. Some people struggle with it, some people get it pretty easy. So we all know as we exercise, we start to breathe more. We start to breathe more heavily. We start to breathe more. We start sweating. Our heart beats faster. There's all sorts of things that increase as a result of us doing exercise. Okay, so where do all these terms, VO2 max, steady state, oxygen uptake, or O2 uptake, where do they all fit in? Okay, you guys are going to need to know it for the exams, if you have exams. Who knows? Okay, so oxygen deficit is at the beginning of the event or exercise or activity or whatever it is, where the oxygen system isn't able to supply the muscles with, or supply enough oxygen for the muscles, you know, to create the energy. Okay. Because like we've talked about in the past, the oxygen system, there are so many more chemical reactions that need to occur in order for it to produce the ATP. Once it's doing it, it keeps on doing it indefinitely, and it produces more than the ATP system, but it takes time. So we borrow the energy from other sources. Okay. Steady state is when the body is able to meet the demand for oxygen. Okay, so let's say you're running your marathon or you're running the 10,000 meter event like you just saw before. The lap times remained constant throughout. Okay, there wasn't much change, if any, you know, around here. The guy was saying, what, 63 to 65 seconds. So it was pretty constant. So there's no extra demand on the body to produce more energy. Okay, so we don't need to work any harder. So we remain at a steady state. If we were to increase that intensity again, then there would be a period of oxygen deficit again. Okay, and then it would eventually, when your levels return to normal, you would again be at that steady state. The final one, oxygen debt, or EPOC, or EPOC is an acronym which stands for excess post-oxygen consumption, post-activity oxygen consumption. It just gets a letter left out. So at the end of the event, your breathing rates, you know, they remain quite high for a period of time. This is because we're replenishing stores of ATP in the muscles, and just basically paying back that deficit that was at the start. Okay, so there's three terms there that you need to know. The other one, VO2 max. VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that your body is able to consume during activity. Okay, so there are tests that can be done. You know, I was kind of hoping we'd be able to arrange one, but I'm not so sure what's happening now. But it's basically a test of, you know, how far you can go until you can't you know, continue anymore. So it's stressing the system to the point that, you know, you've completely exhausted it. Your body can't use any more oxygen. The activity ceases. So let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So oxygen deficit. So when we're talking about the oxygen system, it can't meet the demands of the activity. Okay. The oxygen deficit is the difference between what we need and what can actually be produced at that point in time. So let's say this is what we need, but this is what's actually being produced at that point in time. Okay, so we've literally just started a 100-meter sprint. All right, so this section here, that's the oxygen deficit. Steady state is where the oxygen supply meets the demand. As long as we don't change the intensity, it's going to remain the same. You're going to get that plateau like we saw. So this is what we need. This is what's being produced. So there was no difference. Okay, so oxygen debt or EPOC, excess post-oxygen consumption, post-exercise oxygen consumption. There it is there. It's literally the amount of oxygen that's consumed after exercise, okay, that we don't need. I mean, it's replenishing everything that was used in the activity, but because activity stopped, it's excess to what we actually need. So the oxygen levels are going to remain elevated. It removes the waste products. So what are some of the waste products that it's going to be used to get rid of? No, can't hear anyone. That's because it's video anyway. So it's going to be like lactic acid, the hydrogen ions, the things that were inhibiting our performance while we're working at such a high intensity. It's basically, that's what an active cool down does. It assists, it keeps that oxygen level elevated for a period of time after exercise to get rid of all those waste products. Okay. Think of it like, you know, borrowing money from someone or borrowing something from someone. You've got to eventually pay back your debt. Well, that's what's happening at the end here. So that is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So that's what we need. That's what is actually being produced at the point in time, and then the difference between the two is the oxygen debt or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So there's a relationship between all of this. Okay, there is a relationship between exercise intensity, EPOC, so on and so forth. So an activity that has a low intensity, it's going to have less demand for oxygen, which means that you're going to have a smaller oxygen deficit, you're going to have a longer steady state, all that sort of thing. Okay, but if we have a higher intensity activity, there's going to be greater demands on the anaerobic system. Okay, so you're going to have a larger deficit at the beginning. You'll probably have not much in terms of a steady state, and then you might have a longer oxygen debt at the end. Chapter check questions. Pause the video, go and do them, come back. See you in a bit. Page 133, questions 1, 2, 3, and 5. And there's the questions there if you don't have the textbook. Okay, so hopefully you've done the questions. Let's go have a look at the answers. Okay, so explain under which circumstances an oxygen deficit occurs during activities. So what you should have probably said would be something along the lines of when the body can't keep up with the demands of the activity. So it's most likely going to be, you know, when you're trying to catch up or get away from a pack in a running event. Perhaps it might be cycling, it could be swimming, it could be any one of those. Maybe there's some kind of change in the activity that requires you to work at a higher intensity. Okay, so that's where you're going to get the oxygen deficit during an activity. Yeah, like we already discussed with the marathon runners at the, towards the end of the event, where the person's sprinting to catch up or get away from. Okay, so question 2, when is it advantageous to prolong the oxygen debt? So that's when we're paying back what was used at the start of the event. Okay, so it's going to be advantageous when we're trying to recover. Okay, so that's why people do their active cool downs, after a marathon or after a some sort of long event. People are going to do what's called an active recovery. So it'll be a cool down that is at a lower intensity. The idea being that the heart rate is still going to be elevated more than what it would be if you were doing a passive recovery, just sitting there and doing nothing. And the reason being is because it helps the body get rid of the waste products like lactic acid and the hydrogen ions and all that sort of thing at a quicker rate. Question number 3, the trade-off between an active recovery and fuel restoration. So if we're doing that active recovery, like we've said in the past, it doesn't allow the body the time that it needs to replenish the PC stores. Okay, so the PC stores, they only get replenished when you've done, 3 minutes of complete inactivity. Okay, and this slide is a little bit misleading. It's not 100% for 3 minutes. It's more closer to like that 5 to 10 minutes. The 3 minutes, it'll get you close, but it's not going to be a complete restoration. So that's the trade-off between doing an active recovery and a passive recovery, and I guess it depends on the type of activity that you're doing. So if it's a long distance thing where you don't need the PC to recover, then do an active recovery. But if you need to have the PC stores so you can go and do the series of sprints again, maybe it's 100-meter sprints, well then yes, you would need to do a passive recovery in order to get those fuel stores to replenish quicker. Question 5, the difference between the oxygen deficit and EPOC for athlete A and athlete B. Without actually having read the question, I will have a look. Hold on. So the question, 2 athletes. Athlete A is a trained endurance athlete, whereas athlete B is a 400-meter specialist. So there's obvious differences between the two of them. One's going to have a higher amount of mitochondria. So yeah, athlete A is going to have a more efficient aerobic system. So his excess post-exercise oxygen consumption is going to be a lot shorter than athlete B's, because their aerobic system is better at delivering energy. Athlete's B aerobic system, it's not going to function as well as athlete A's because it's not trained, so they're going to have less mitochondria. They can't utilize the oxygen as well. So yeah, they're the fundamental differences between the two of them. Okay, so exam questions. You are going to see a lot of exam questions leading up to, well, depending on what happens for the rest of the year, you're going to see a lot. I've shown you the book in the past. Have a go at that. All right. It is, yes, Cade, what can I do for you? Okay, back again. Yeah, so do the book. The book is, like I've said in the past, it's like almost 10 years of interplay exam questions. Practice, because if you can get these questions right, then you will, have anywhere between 6 and maybe 10 marks. It varies from time to time. But get familiar with it. The wording, the stories, they all change, but essentially what it's asking you is still the same. So have a look over on the next slide, and there will be 3 videos from Ed Rollo, which you should be doing at home. So if you're not, get on with it.
So here we go. We're going to just have a bit of a Kobe Bryant case study here coming from the 2017 VCAR exam. And what we're basically asked to do is provide information about the energy requirements for the final 3 minutes of this match, Kobe Bryant's final match in his career. Notice here that within the question itself, we're also provided with a few sort of stimulus, I suppose, points of reference here. So things like that reverse layup that he just did a moment ago, as well as other aspects of the game, as he's just down here, standing right now. He's about to respond. He slowly brings the ball up the court. Like, we can talk about all these aspects of the game. We can fast forward and find other things that he's doing. For example, free throw shooting, where he's going to the line, the intensity's dropped right down, and there's a different energy requirement at that time. So what you had to have here is a wrong knowledge of the energy systems where you could apply it to all of these different aspects of his final 3 minutes. Everything from high intensity stuff like reverse layups and pulling up for jump shots and 3-pointers, down to lower intensity efforts like standing, walking, being substituted, or sitting down in a timeout right now, as you can see here, while shooting free throws. Totally different energy requirements. So that's what was required of you in the 2017 V. So let's attempt this question. I've written a bit of a long response here, but I'll break it down and make it a bit simpler. So you'll notice here already straight up that opening sentence, all 3 systems would have contributed to Kobe's energy requirements during the final 3 minutes of the match. So again, I linked it there. I linked it to the example in the question. I was talking about the final 3 minutes. I then talked about the aerobic system. Okay, I wanted to talk about that first because I felt like there was quite a few periods where there was lower intensity efforts. Things like free throws, standing out of the play, walking and jogging down the court. I've dug up real specific basketball examples there and linked it to the aerobic system. I also said that it would have been dominant when he was off the court, things like being substituted and during timeouts. So all of that stuff in there is talking about the aerobic system. Then I want to talk about all the high intensity stuff he does as well. So the high intensity efforts would be increasing contributions from the 2 anaerobic systems at that point in time. Now it's important to understand that how much CP that's readily available at any given time will influence which one of the 2 anaerobic systems is dominant for that effort. So if adequate rest had been provided, for example, after substitution or after the free throw shooting, then the CP fuel would be available for the CP system to provide the energy for that next effort. If, however, the high intensity movements such as the reverse layups, pull-up jump shots and that, if they didn't follow periods of adequate rest, then the anaerobic glycolysis system would be required to provide the energy because the CP system's fatigued. So I've talked about ATP-CP, I've talked about anaerobic glycolysis. And then I finished it off with, I sort of wanted to have a holistic thing here and talk about the aerobic system being the predominant system over the entire of the final 3 minutes. So talking again about predominance over the whole duration there. So there you go, a pretty big, full-on Kobe Bryant case study that we took from the 2017 VCAR exam. But again, a really significant kind of question. Okay, so if you're wondering about how significant this interplay question is, well, just have a look at the last 4 years of VCAR exams. That Kobe Bryant example from 2017. In 2016, we had this netball example. In 2015, we had an AFL example. And in 2014, we had a volleyball example. And to be perfectly honest, the question is exactly the same each time. That Kobe Bryant one, talk about the energy contributions in the last 3 minutes. Here, using the information above, discuss the similarities and differences in the energy requirements of a centre player and a goal shooter. So you just had to mash up all and basically give energy system interplay for two different people in the same game. A bit more complicated, same concepts there. 2015, using examples from the account, explain how the energy system interplay provided energy for Zach to complete this passage of play, this AFL passage of play, and all that energy system knowledge, grabbing bits of information from this question, provide a response. 2014, using the information provided, describe the interplay of the systems in volleyball. Again, taking that information, talking about the energy systems in an intermittent team sport. It's basically been 4 years of the same concept across 4 different sports. So your understanding of the energy systems and the way that it interplays with each other is so, so important here. These questions are big markers, 5, 6, and 6. Out of 120 marks, they're really significant questions. So great chance for you to practice using these questions here in the montage.
That's it. That is the interplay of energy systems and everything done. That's chapter 6. Chapter 7 will follow soon.